Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we'll be doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Fast 10 open to a pretty decent size international opening and a possibly franchise lowest domestic opening. We'll actually break down those numbers and see where this film actually compares domestically to the others in the franchise, while of course adjusting for inflation, but also trying to give an estimate as far as how many actual tickets were sold on the opening weekends for all of the Fast and Furious franchise. I did a little bit of work before heading out over this past weekend, and we'll see if I'm able to, let's just say, get through all of the numbers because, oh my goodness, 10 movies! 10 movies in this franchise. I gave up after 6. I've always been very open as to why that is the case on my streams. Maybe we'll talk about that. We'll also give some updates on Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which continues to kill it in the box office, continuing to show why it is a success and actually passing the break-even point that I had set for it. So doing very, very well. And even for the higher-end break-even points that some people had, closer to maybe $700 million, it's looking like it's going to cash in on that or get close to that number over the next week or so. So we'll talk about all of those things, including other things like Super Mario Brothers, and also an update on the film Nefarious. But before going any further, please make sure you smash that like button, lap that fire button, you're watching Ozzy, smash the rumble button as well. Also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every video live stream goes live on the channel. And first, let's say thank you. I just first want to say thank you to everyone for understanding being out of town this weekend. Did not have my live stream on Saturday, was not able to be on FNT. So again, thank you to everyone for understanding. And I plan to go back to my regularly scheduled streaming schedule over the next week at least. May is just a crazy, crazy month. And June, I'm sure, will be even crazier with the beginning of summer. But as the headline from Deadline is saying from Tony over at Deadline, Fast 10 stays steady towards $67 million opening, 4% behind Fast 9 early Sunday AM box office update. Now, of course, this does not actually account for things like inflation, even though the film didn't come out, Fast 9 at least, did not come out too many years ago, still enough to be infected by inflation, not to mention average ticket price as well. But it is interesting that this film is 4% behind Fast 9, and Fast 9 came out during the midst of the pandemic, when a lot of theaters were still closed, right? It definitely was on the healthier end of pandemic times as theaters were starting to reopen. But internationally, especially this movie, Fast 9, was not able to have nearly as many theaters available to it as we have in today's international market. So is this film any good? Let's go ahead and look at the actual numbers themselves. As it says right here, the Louis Lederer directed Fast 10 on Friday came in at $28 million, with Saturday easing by 21% to $22.2 for what has always been an expected $67 million start for the 10th quel. This is just $3 million shy of Fast 9's $70 million. Not too bad. Again, context is very much key to this. It's interesting how often Tony and so many others from Deadline and again all these other outlets will bring up the pandemic for certain films, but then won't bring up that context for movies like this, where it's like, wait a minute, this is actually not nearly as good as you think, because this film should actually be a lot higher, right? Fast 9 did not have as many theaters as a film like Fast 10 has, not just domestically, but also internationally. And so to say it came in not only behind, but also $3 million behind, I don't know. That seems to me to be a sign that things really aren't very good for this movie, at least looking at it from a domestic standpoint. A little bit of a different story if we look at the numbers internationally. As you can see, the headline over here is Fast 10 speeds the $319 million global opening. And this is from Nancy, good old Nance over at Deadline. As it says right here, now it is the second best worldwide debut of the year. Yes, indeed. So, again, the best start to a movie this year, rather the second best start, only behind the Super Mario Brothers movie, and we know where that film ended up. I think the big question is going to be, hey, whereas Super Mario was able to have a pretty healthy mix of domestic and international, this movie is incredibly international heavy to an insane degree when you actually look at and compare those numbers to each other. Looking internationally at where this film actually stands versus some of the others in the franchise, especially more recently, it says here that it's the number 3 best of the franchise when you exclude China and previews, saying that it's 77% ahead of Fast 9. So again, that's definitely a good sign, because Fast 9 was impacted, especially internationally, by the pandemic, but it was also able to do something, well, I don't know if this film's actually going to be able to do, right? Fast 9 was actually able to capitalize on a hunger that a lot of people had for just dumb fun entertainment at the theater. A lot of people actually went out to go see that movie Internationally, not as much. Domestically, it's looking like the domestic market is still very much being impacted by being a little bit more aware of what they're spending their money on, which is one of the many reasons why I think the franchise is not seeing as much love from the domestic market. But either way, still doing much better internationally than Fast 9 without China. 36% ahead of Hobbs and Shaw, as I think any film should be. 13 and 17% below, though, the Fast and Furious, The Fate of the Furious, which would be Fast and Furious 8 and Furious 7. So this film is coming underneath some of the biggest films of the franchise. And so, again, is the franchise healthy at this point in time? I would say it's not really looking like that is the actual case. Going over to the numbers, as you can see for the domestic market at the very least, $67.5 million opening weekend, so not really coming in over expectations. The early indications were that it would at the very least be above $60 million. We were never given an exact number on that, but still the fact that it did come in at 67.5 is definitely a decent start for this movie. Did not come in well underneath projections, but also did not really surprise, right? It didn't do a Super Mario Brothers where that film came in and broke every projection and performed so much better. This film's not really seeing the same thing, and there's some decent word of mouth on this movie, but not nearly as good as a film like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, for instance. And so whereas Guardians, in its third week of release, is seeing another very strong hold, right? Remember last week it had a hold sub 50%, which was the best of the franchise. Guess what? That has continued on. Some people were speculating that, hey, could we see the film just drop out completely with competition? Turns out that is not actually the case, especially since Fast 10 is not nearly as strong as a domestic property, which I think is a very interesting dynamic. In fact, you could end up seeing a film like Guardians even surpass the weekly numbers of a Fast 10 just after just a week or two, if you look at these numbers, and if the film is actually able to, kind of fend this off and actually end up doing better, even though it's been out for a little bit longer than Fast 10. So that'll be interesting domestically, especially for it to actually look at. Also interesting that that Fast 10 is not out in as nearly as many theaters as a film like Guardians 3 is, and so we'll be following that. Coming to number 3 spot, though, domestically, $9.8 million, a 22% hold for the Super Mario Brothers movie. This movie is now available on VOD and PVOD after 7 weeks of release, so, hey, that is a choice that they decided to make. I don't quite understand it officially because they are still making some decent money, even with that being the case. This film basically is slowing down quite a bit. This film is looking to end somewhere around 1.4 billion, which is still more than enough to pay for the next 5 or 6 movies coming out from Universal and Nintendo. But still, it's interesting for them to be putting it out this early. It seems very early, at least, for this movie. Maybe they're thinking they can capitalize on some of the momentum and they get a lot more returns on the PVOD sales. Again, maybe they're just trying to really shore up any profits from this movie as they are getting quite a bit from it. Coming in the number 4 spot is Book Club, The Next Chapter, everyone's favorite sequel. $3 million there, a 55% drop in its second week of release, so really not looking all that impressive from Focus Features. Evil Dead Rise continuing to add to its overall profits. Still been out for 5 weeks, $2.3 million, 36% hold, so pretty strong numbers there. John Wick Chapter 4, still in the top 10 from Lionsgate, $1.3 million, so not nearly as much, but this movie is getting to the point of not just being on PVOD, but it's also very quickly getting close to its physical media release sometime in June, July. I think it's actually sometime in June. Obviously, those numbers and those dates can sometimes change, but hey, cool to see this film after 9 weeks still hanging around in the top 10. Are you there, Margaret? Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret from Lionsgate. Also, a similar number there, but has been out half the time, so as you can see, one a box office success for Lionsgate, the other not so much. The film Hypnotic, starring Ben Affleck from Ketchup Entertainment, I believe Robert Rodriguez directed this movie, had a 66% drop, dropping out of 385 screens. This film, based off especially its much higher than it should have been budget, is set to be a box office flop. The film Blackberry, about, you guessed it, the history of the founding of BlackBerry. I guess that's kind of what we're doing now with movies. I will say the trailer actually does look quite compelling and quite interesting. However, it definitely kind of is, not really having much as far as originality is concerned. Made $525,000, which even its per theater ratio, because it's not out in a lot of screens, is not really that impressive. But hey, it's made over $1 million not being out in a lot of screens. So hey, IFC Films, if that's good for you, only you will really be able to know at this point. And then coming in the number 10 spot, Love Again from Sony, 72% drop in its third week of release. This film basically being abandoned by Sony, as this film has not really made any money whatsoever. Also, a little update on Dungeons & Dragons. Even with PVOD being available, this film is also still adding a little bit of extra cash. It's not going to be enough to break even, still a massive flop, but hey, they are trying at the very least. And then we also have the film Nefarious, which is dropping another 29%. So even though it's still hanging out at hundreds of screens, its per theater ratio is actually pretty decent after being out for 6 weeks, has made $5 million. This film is actually officially a chart breaker, according to my charting. However, all the money essentially has come from the domestic market. It has not been announced when this film will be available on demand. I know a lot of people are waiting for that to happen because it's just not been available in a lot of places. And I still don't know a budget on this movie to be able to say for sure whether the film is making money or not, but I could definitely say that based off of how Hollywood has been treating this movie, it is doing much better than it has any right to actually do. And it's a great film, and if it's playing near you, absolutely go and see it. Going into the actual international numbers here, Fast 10, right? $318.8 million, so pretty large disparity there. 67 versus $251 million. We're going to wait, of course, for the numbers to update their international charts over the coming days, but I would not be surprised if the vast majority of that money comes directly from China. And yes, I will call out studios that do dealings with the Communist Party. And some people say, it's not fair to go after China. Well, again, I'm going specifically after the Communist Party there. And I'm going to continue to do that because of the human rights violations. And yeah, studios do not need that money. Joker showed everybody that, yeah, you can have a rated R film make $1 billion all without China, meaning you're not actually supporting the CCP. Remember, 75% of the ticket sales go to the CCP, which means millions upon millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars every single year of Hollywood money is going to support that party, is going to support those human rights violations. And I think that that is something that all studios need to back away from immediately because they do not need it. Anyway, coming in at $318.8 million, still a pretty strong start. But where does this actually stand internationally and domestically in the actual franchise itself? Well, pulling up the numbers data, as you can see, first off, the big number for me that kind of sticks out is that $340 million production budget. It's insane that this movie is costing almost $350 million or so. It's just insane that it's gotten to the point where they have to spend that much money on these movies. It's gotten to the point where they have to essentially make around $1 billion just to be able to break even, or at the very least guarantee that they're going to make something back on their investment. And it's looking like, especially with the domestic being so low, it's not likely going to be nearly as profitable as it may have been in previous years. What I mean by that is if you look at these previous movies, Fast 9, of course, actually had a higher domestic opening, and these have all been adjusted using the calculations from thenumbers.com. I have my own charting that I'll show in a second. But even Hobbs & Shaw had a higher opening weekend than Fast 10 did. And again, that is not a movie that any film should be losing to, just based off of how bad Hobbs & Shaw actually was. But notice here the huge difference, right? Furious 7 was obviously the biggest. They have been adding to their numbers since Fast 4 and 5, especially Fast 5. But $125 million for Fast 6, $182 million. A lot of that probably was pushed by the death of Paul Walker. A lot of people wanting to basically say goodbye. That ended up getting $437 million domestically. Now compare that to Fast Furious 8. Again, went down almost by half, but still had a pretty decent showing domestically, in addition to its international $1.1 billion. What's interesting is that fell off quite a bit with Hobbs & Shaw. Domestically, just did not do much of anything. Comparing that to also Fast 9, $70 million, $173 million. But that movie did do something that a lot of films up in 2021 were not actually doing, which was actually showing up in those international markets. And so even though this is definitely a good sign for Fast 10 that it is making money, we don't have a like-for-like comparison as far as overall day-and-date release, because Fast 9 had a very weird release. Again, 2021 was a very weird year, and so the film was kind of all over the place. That's why I actually went back in my charting, and I didn't have an opening weekend or a first 2 weeks for this movie, because of how weird the actual release schedule was with COVID and all that nonsense. Fast 10, though, obviously, we are looking at this film, and I think the best film to really compare it to, as far as like-for-like release, is the 4,046 screens here. Interestingly enough, though, and this is something that's quite odd, actually, now that I'm looking at it, Fast 10, we like to do this stuff live. So Fast 10 actually had less theaters available than Fast 9 did. Now, that's probably a lot because of competition, but also we know domestically, back in 2021, domestically, more theaters were open than internationally. And so I think that's why, again, it's just fascinating to look at these comparisons in this way. But even the 4,200, 4,300 of the Fate of the Furious 8, going all the way back, you can see, right, this movie should have been out in a lot more screens. And so could this be that you have a lot of competition, more than what was expected, coming out from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3? That very well could be the case. Maybe they don't have as much confidence because they've seen kind of the trend the last couple of years, especially the last couple of releases with Hobbs and Shaw and then Fast 9. That could be it too. I just find it very interesting and fascinating because I think ultimately we're going to see this film come in well underneath where we saw Fast 9 and even Hobbs and Shaw. Hobbs and Shaw actually performed better than Fast 9 did. And again, makes sense to me looking at it from based on the years. Internationally, though, is going to be kind of the real story of where this film ultimately ends up being. But as you can see here, just comparing these numbers, right, from first Sunday, right, 67 versus 70 versus 68 versus 115. So domestically, this film really isn't all that impressive. Now, I've done my own number crunching using inflation calculations from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. So if anyone's wondering where I got that data from. And I also have been able to adjust not only the budgets for these movies, but also the opening domestic box office. So let's go back in time a little bit, all right? So the first Fast and Furious film cost about $65 million. Kind of insane to compare the $65 million versus the $340 million that was cost that the first Fast and Furious film cost, right? It's just insane, the disparity there. What is interesting, though, is actually the Fate of the Furious, so Fast and Furious 8, when you adjust those numbers, actually ended up costing $312 million. What's also interesting is that the number of ticket sales for those films really didn't show itself to have any type of return on investment. Looking at the actual domestic box office openings, as you can see, at $67 million, this movie is actually the second lowest opening weekend when adjusted. The only film that it does actually beat is Tokyo Drift. Now, I love Tokyo Drift. I have a very soft spot in my heart for Tokyo Drift, but I can even admit that film was just not like the other movies. That film just did not get to the same level because it was kind of a weird one, right? It didn't really fit in the franchise. You had some connections to the main characters towards the very end of the movie, but most of it is all about these brand new characters in this brand new environment. They were really trying to, rebuild, figure things out, and it just didn't really work for a lot of people. I loved it, but a lot of people don't. But what's interesting is that Fast 10 is now officially, right, the second lowest when you actually adjust those numbers. Even Fast and Furious 1, the first in the franchise, had a $71 million domestic opening weekend. What's also interesting is when you look at the overall ticket sales, right? So you have 7 million tickets. Again, this is using the average ticket price of that year adjusted for inflation compared to the number adjusted for inflation, right? So it cancels itself out in that way. So around 7 million tickets opening weekend was sold for the first one. For the second one, about 13 million. That dropped off quite a bit with the third one. Makes a lot of sense. Then it picked up a little bit with the fourth one, right? People started to get a little more interested, right? Started to do a little bit better. I had a $100 million opening for that fourth one. 9 million tickets, 10 million tickets, $118 million for the next one. Then you have 11.9 million tickets versus $128 million. You also have the 17 versus, so as you can see, right, some pretty decent numbers. And then it starts to fall off a little bit, right, with that 11 million tickets being for the Fate of the Furious. So that was Fast Furious 8, which also was the second most expensive film in the franchise. And this is when I think things start to kind of go off the rails, especially domestically, is that when you're spending that much more on your movie, right, you're spending another $50+ million or so in comparison to the previous film in your franchise, and you're not getting a huge return on investment, right? And actually, you get a lower opening weekend. I think that ultimately you start to need to think, ask some questions and say, are we really supposed to, and should we be spending this kind of money? And then you go to Hobbs and Shaw, and then you go to Fast 9, and then you have where you are here today. What's interesting is that this film has the lowest number of ticket sales, except for Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift. And I think that this kind of ultimately shows this film is not doing very well domestically. I think the franchise, we can say, is kind of dead in the domestic marketplace. Now, where does this film actually stand, and where will it stand internationally? Only time will tell on that one. Guardians 3, though, hey, time is already on its side here. $659 million after just a few weeks of release. This film is doing very massive numbers, all right? And I know some people might try to say, yeah, but look how much money, $66.7 million from China, right? That's a huge portion of its overall sales. But guess what? When you take into account it's made $392 million, that's over $300 million coming from other areas and other places, in addition to the film being on its way to possibly, not just $300 million, but somewhere between $300 and $350 million domestically. And so I think when you look at those numbers, you look how it's doing in other countries outside of China, you're still looking at a film that's probably going to end somewhere around $800 to $900 million. So definitely not the best of the franchise, and definitely not going to be anything to write home about comparing to other MCU movies. But comparing this to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, comparing even this to films like Black Panther: Wakanda Forever and Thor: Love and Thunder, this is definitely a much more positive direction. But I think this is more so a sign that Guardians is very popular, not necessarily with the MCU, right? The positive word of mouth on this has a lot to do with people like Chris Pratt, has a lot to do with the character of Rocket Raccoon and the voice work and the voice acting and the character design being done for those characters as well. And so, again, MCU not looking like it's all that good as far as its overall position is concerned, but for Guardians, it's showing there's a lot of health still in this IP, even at this time when the MCU has been in the decline. Super Mario Bros. Movie at $1.2 billion, looking like, again, slowing down a little bit, probably going to end somewhere around 1.3 to 1.4 billion. That's still holding true at this point. Book Club at 16.7 million. Everyone, of course, wanted to know about that. Evil Dead, $141 million, continuing to add to its profits. Same thing with John Wick Chapter 4. Again, will it get to 450 million? I don't think it's got enough in the tank for that, but hey, it was able to pass $40 million, and I was still definitely wrong on that. Again, glad that the numbers finally got updated there. $18.6 million for Are You There, God's Me Margaret. Hypnotic at only $4.3 million. This film is essentially guaranteed to be a flop. Blackberry, I'm more interested in this movie because of Glenn Howerton in that makeup. I was just immediately when I saw the trailer, I'm like, oh, this should be interesting because I like Glenn Howerton from It's Always Sunny. But oh man, he is doing a very different kind of character for this movie. So I'm actually interested to go see it, but it's not really a big box office film. Love, again, at $10.4 million. Don't really care. Nefarious, great film. Go see it if it's playing near you. I can't wait for it to be available on demand so that way more people have access to it. But made $5 million. A film that has had everything going against it. Still, the fact that it made even multiple millions, not all that much, but still, with everything going on, I definitely got to give kudos to that. Going into the box office charting, because I love doing box office charting here at OMB Reviews, we can start to make some estimates. So first off, Hypnotic in its second week of release. I'm sure everyone wants to hear about this. So at $4.3 million, I'm projecting the film to end somewhere between $6 and $8 million, which when you look at the numbers, $65 million budget, break even around 162. You're looking at a film around $100 million of a loss. So somewhere in the $90 million range. Not very good for the Robert Rodriguez movie, and I think it calls into question not just the profitability of Robert Rodriguez, but also even that of Ben Affleck. It also shows, right, these names aren't what sell anymore, right? It's not the names of the people attached to the movie that sell tickets, right? It might sell some tickets, but ultimately it's, does the film actually look good? Is the marketing campaign at all good? And is the word of mouth on the movie, right? Which of course demands that the film be at least somewhat competent. Is that good? Those are what make movies successful these days. And so of course we'll see if Fast 10 is able to emulate that. Right now at $318 million worldwide, it's still around $318 million in the red. Again, the break-even point I have on this movie is $850. I know some people might have it as high as $1 billion though, and I think $1 billion is really where it needs to get if it wants to comfortably be profitable, because the vast majority of its money is coming from China, at least at this point in time. And since they only get 25% of those receipts, that means, hey, that break even is technically a lot higher, as this is taking into account typical standard and practices. $318 million loss currently at this point in time, though, so jury's still out, but we'll wait and see. Hypnotic, as I said, looking like it's going to be almost close to $100 million of a loss. Book Club, also projected to be a loss after a couple weeks of release, somewhere around $15 to $9 million. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, I currently have this film as now being profitable. Its break-even point was $625. I think some people have it at 3 times the overall budget. It's at 2.6, so even if you have it at the low end like I am, hey, right now it's made $20 million in profit, and I think ultimately when everything is said and done, when it gets close to that 8 to 850, maybe even close to $900 million, when all those numbers come in, I think you're just going to look at this film having around $100 million in net gain, net profit. And even though it's definitely not as strong as it should be, or as they would want it to be, it's still a success nonetheless, especially when you compare it to the films that have been coming out from the MCU more recently. Love, again, is a flop. Big George Foreman as well continues to be a flop. Sisu also continues not really to perform as well as what some people may have wanted it to, but it's still out in theaters. I know some people like it. I think the trailer's better personally. Are There, Guys Me Margaret, also still a flop. Guy Ritchie's Covenant, unfortunately, is also still a flop. Evil Dead Rise now at $56 million in net gain profits. Nefarious, as I'd mentioned, is officially a chart breaker. As you can see, it's more than doubled its money over the last, since its first couple weeks. It's doubled the first 2 weeks of its release, which not a lot of films do very often. And so, hey, kudos to them for being a chart breaker over here on OMB Reviews. Renfield, of course, is pretty much done. Super Mario Bros. Movie at $1.2 billion. Almost $600 million. This film it has a chance of being a chart breaker, but even if it gets somewhat even close at 51 or 52%, if that's where it ends up being, you're still looking at $600 million in profit. You can fund essentially the next 6 movies. And that's not even counting the PVOD sales that are now coming in for that movie also. John Wick Chapter 4, have it at over $100 million in net gain profit as well. And then the last film that I will, update here as far as, Ant-Man the Wasp, of course, still also a box office flop. Those are the numbers as they currently stand. What are y'all's thoughts? Do you think that Fast 10 is going to be able to make all its money internationally? That seems to be what's going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised to see the film be the lowest grossing of the entire Fast franchise domestically, but internationally, who knows? Again, it'll be interesting to see the comparison between this and Fast 9. That's going to be the most interesting because Fast 9 numbers had pandemic issues internationally, especially. And so even though I think this film is going to come in very much below any of the other movies' domestic totals. Those international numbers, still a big question mark next to it. Also, what are y'all's thoughts about Guardians? Are you surprised to see the film continuing to do very well? Again, I think it's beyond question at this point that this film is a financial success. With that kind of drop 2 weeks in a row, just very, very strong holds. The positive word of mouth has obviously helped that film quite a bit. But Fast 10, what kind of drop-off do you think we're going to see next weekend? It's had decent word of mouth, at least at this point in time. So we'll have to wait and see, but what are y'all's thoughts? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you like the video, smash that like button, like the fire button. Honestly, smash the rumble button as well. You're all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Sunday, and as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my patrons at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above. Starting off with my patrons over on Patreon, Father Luca Illich, Hymir Irie Hymason, Garrett Searles, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Orange Chat Reviews, who you can check out over at his YouTube channel, Orange Chat Reviews, Laura, the Modern Major General Story, Rosetta Allen, who you can check out at her YouTube channel of Eagle Rider, and Miss Modern Muses, who you can check out at her YouTube channel by the same name as well. Also to my Subscribe Star peeps, Matt317, check him out over on Twitch, Fast Reaction, The R, Mr. Roy, J-Rod, The Beer Guru, and ZK-Man, you can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. And lastly, to my local supporters, Miss Minnesota Hockey Fan, How About a Hockey Player, J.H. Schwalbach, and Robert Barnes, the amazing lawyer. Thank y'all very much for supporting me at that Keep It the Bifrost level and above. And if you want your name shout out at the end of every video and live stream, make sure to check out the top link in the video description in order to get access to that. Also, there's a level where you get access to an exclusive podcast that I do with my friend John the Flip Flickinger, and also to a giveaways channel on my Discord where you get access to the giveaways of various 4K titles, including right now I've got a 4K Steelbook for Training Day. I got the 7th Seal from Criterion, Plane Trains Automobiles, Kubo and the Two Strings, They Live, Train to Busan, tons of others every single week, every single month, rather every single week. I'm going to stick by that. We're doing this live. I just recently gave away the 3 Steelbook collection for John Wick franchise, the amazing Stash Book Collection version. So if you want to have access to various things like that, hey, check out that top link in the video description below. You're all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.